You have never heard this story told properly. In July 2012, 11 men slipped out of Victoria, British Columbia, aboard a chartered fishing boat called the Ocean Pearl. Over the following weeks, in international waters roughly 300 kilometers off the coast of Haida, Gwaii, they carried out what is still, to this day, the largest geoengineering experiment in human history. No government permit, no peer review, no one watching, just 100 tons of iron dust, a garden hose pumping it into the Pacific, and a man named Russ George who had convinced a struggling indigenous fishing village he could do the impossible: bring their salmon back from the edge of extinction. Here's what nobody tells you. By the time anyone outside that village found out, satellites were already tracking a plankton bloom roughly the size of Jamaica, visible from orbit. And the legal loophole George used to make all of it possible? 14 years later, in 2026, it is technically still open. There's a wound in the ocean most people have never heard of. Roughly a third of the world's oceans, an expanse of water nearly as large as every continent on Earth combined, are what oceanographers privately call green deserts. Nitrogen, phosphorus, all the nutrients that should turn seawater into a jungle of life sit there, completely untouched, starving, because they are missing exactly one ingredient: iron. Without it, phytoplankton, the microscopic organisms that produce roughly half the oxygen you just breathed, cannot bloom. Scientists have a name for fixing this. They call it ocean iron fertilization. And these same dead waters were once part of a planetary machine, one that pulled billions of tons of carbon out of the sky and buried it at the bottom of the sea, cycle after cycle, for millions of years. For decades, scientists have known this machine still exists. They've also known it's switched off, and that finding the key, even in one small patch of ocean, could pull carbon from the atmosphere faster than almost anything humans have ever built. Every year, humanity pours roughly 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the sky. Somewhere in that third of the ocean was a lever nobody had been allowed to pull. Nobody had ever figured out how to touch it safely. Before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand exactly how hard the world's scientists fought to keep it that way. For decades, the official answer was simple: don't touch it. In 1988, an oceanographer named John Martin stood up at a seminar, half joking in a mock movie villain accent, and said the line that would end up haunting this entire story: "Give me half a tanker of iron, and I'll give you an ice age." He died in 1993, months before anyone tested his own hypothesis in open water. Over the next 16 years, 13 separate scientific teams did what Martin never lived to do. One of them, a 2004 Southern Ocean experiment called IFEX, later published in the journal Nature, tracked its bloom as it died and found that at least half of it sank below 1,000 meters, taking its carbon down for centuries. Every single atom of iron they added triggered the ocean to pull down more than 13,000 atoms of carbon. It was real. It worked. Just not everywhere, and not automatically. Sometimes the same kind of bloom just got eaten by the next creature up the food chain, and the carbon went nowhere. By 2008, the consensus was blunt: this might work under the right conditions, but nobody was ready to try it at real scale. The United Nations agreed. A global moratorium was signed. Ocean iron fertilization was, for all practical purposes, over. Case closed. Or so everyone thought. The question nobody was asking out loud yet: what happens when a global moratorium doesn't come with a lock? The man who would answer that question was born Darcy Russell George in December 1949 in the United States. By 2012, almost nobody calls him that. He goes by Russ, and he has already reinvented himself twice. A tree planting company he founded in Canada in 1973 would eventually claim credit for planting over 250 million trees. After the cold fusion craze swept the science world in the late 1980s, he co-founded a company chasing that too. He was, at one point, an actual crew member on Greenpeace's Rainbow Warrior, and later, one of Greenpeace's loudest critics. He holds no university degree. He has no formal background in oceanography, chemistry, or climate science. And yet, by the time he arrives in Old Masset, a Haida fishing village of roughly 750 people on the northern coast of Haida, Gwaii, he calls himself something else entirely. Not a businessman chasing his next venture, but a man who believed he'd finally found his destiny, the world's leading expert on restoring the ocean. The moment that summoned everything that followed traces back to a volcano. In August 2008, Kasatochi erupted in Alaska's Aleutian Islands and blanketed the Gulf of Alaska in iron-rich ash. 2 years later, the Fraser River saw its biggest sockeye salmon run in nearly a century, over 34 million fish, up from barely 1.5 million the year before. Government scientists called it a fascinating coincidence. One factor among several. This is where George did something nobody else studying that salmon run was willing to do. He didn't see a coincidence. He saw a cause. And where 13 research teams had spent 16 years quietly asking for more data, George went looking for a boat. And here's where the story gets strange. Old Masset wasn't a random choice. Years earlier, under a different company, George had already scouted this exact stretch of water, the Haida Eddies, as one of 6 planned fertilization sites worldwide. He had been circling this ocean for years before he ever set foot in the village. Here's the part almost no documentary explains properly. George's core idea was never actually new. Scientists had been testing ocean iron fertilization, safely and legally, for 16 years already. What George changed wasn't the science. It was the rule book. In 2007, under his company Planktos, he had already attempted almost this exact experiment once before a 100-ton iron dump planned near the Galapagos Islands, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Governments and environmental groups shut it down before a single bag hit the water. He was blocked again in the Canary Islands. And according to Jim Thomas of the watchdog group HCC Group, George's Galapagos attempt is the specific reason the United Nations passed its global moratorium in the first place. He didn't just break a rule that already existed. He was the reason regulators wrote it. So by 2012, George asked a different question. Instead of fertilizing the ocean as a company, spending his own money inside a country that could prosecute him, what if someone else's money paid for it? Someone else's boat carried it, and it happened in international waters where no single government's laws clearly applied. That was the insight, not a scientific breakthrough, a jurisdictional one. In September 2010, George and the village's own economic development officer set up the company to make it happen, projecting in the paperwork that the venture could earn as much as $35 million in its very first year, a return of nearly 1,300% for nearly 3 months. This stayed a secret even though Canada's own government had quietly opened an investigation into it on August 30th, 2012. Without telling the public, the truth only surfaced because 2 staffers from ECC Group sat in a United Nations Biodiversity Conference in Hyderabad, India, that October, and overheard something that didn't add up. Days later, on October 15th, 2012, Guardian reporter Martin Lukacs published the story that broke it open across the world. Canada's Environment Minister, Peter Kent, called it rogue science and promised prosecution to the full extent of the law. By March 2013, investigators had executed 3 separate search warrants on the company's offices, a seafood business, and the Ocean Pearl itself. But here's the part almost nobody was saying publicly at the time. The same kind of bloom this experiment can trigger is capable of producing a neurotoxin called domoic acid, the same toxin behind a fatal poisoning outbreak in Prince Edward Island back in 1987. In the second half of 2012, Canadian food inspectors recorded a spike in exactly that toxin along Haida, Gwaii's northern coast. Local residents reported the strongest red tides anyone could remember. The Haida community that funded this, a village already living with unemployment near 20%, watched its environmental reputation get dragged through headlines on 3 continents. Some families stopped speaking to each other over it. Not everyone in the village felt deceived. CIRC's own economic development officer would later insist the community had approached George, not the other way around. But 100 kilometers south, in the neighboring Haida community of Skidegate, which never got a vote, families watched their own reputation as environmental stewards take the damage anyway. Gu Zhao, then president of the Haida Nation, said it plainly. The people of Old Masset were promised this was a salmon restoration scheme. The carbon credits meant to repay the village's $2.5 million investment never materialized. The Swiss firm brought in to broker them looked at the numbers and walked away. There was no market for what George had promised to sell. Not one credit was ever generated. Lesser people walk away at this point. George didn't. In May 2013, his own partners fired him as chief scientist. He sued them instead, dragging the fight through court until 2016. And rather than accept what nearly every independent scientist would go on to conclude, he spent the next decade insisting, publicly, that he had been right all along. 1 year later, in 2013, something did happen. that nobody can fully explain. Pink salmon returns exploded across the Pacific Northwest, from Alaska down to California. In Southeast Alaska alone, fisheries managers had forecast a catch of 54 million pink salmon. The actual number came in around 224 million, the largest salmon catch in the region's recorded history. George called it vindication. University of Victoria oceanographer Kenneth Denman offered a very different explanation. The Haida eddies produce a natural plankton bloom every single summer, with or without added iron. Stretching up to 1,000 kilometers offshore and untangling George's intervention from that background noise was likely impossible. A major 2017 review in the journal Nature went further, concluding flatly that scientists had found no evidence the experiment worked at all. To this day, nobody can definitively prove George right, or prove him wrong. That uncertainty is exactly why this story refuses to die. And here's the twist nobody saw coming. As of October 2025, the international law written specifically because of this incident, the one meant to permanently close the loophole George slipped through, still is not binding. Only 9 of 55 member nations have ratified it. It needs 37. 14 years later, the exact legal gray zone Russ George exploited is technically still standing wide open, but the science itself never actually died. On February 5, 2026, 24 researchers from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, Scripps, the University of Hawaii, and the Bigelow Laboratory published a peer-reviewed case in the journal Dialogues on Climate Change for testing ocean iron fertilization, again this time legally, transparently, with government oversight, and pointedly refusing to sell a single carbon credit. Their proposed site, the Gulf of Alaska, the exact ocean system George targeted in 2012. Researchers chose the Pacific over the Southern Ocean specifically because it's safer and easier to monitor for a first legal attempt at real scale, the exact caution Russ George skipped entirely in 2012. Lead scientist Ken Buseler put it simply, cutting emissions alone will not be enough. Humanity needs every legitimate tool on the table, tested properly this time, full monitoring, built-in shutoff points, public data, everything the ocean pearl never had. Meanwhile, on his own website, George is still telling this story, except by 2026. In his own retelling, the bloom has grown to the size of Switzerland, and he now compares himself, without irony, to Galileo. The idea itself was never the problem. John Martin was right that the ocean holds a switch. Nobody has ever proven Russ George was the one meant to flip it, only that he refused to wait for permission. What science is being handed now, legally, is the same chance he took illegally in 2012. Somewhere out there is a genuine answer to a problem this size tested, patient, still waiting for its moment. The next person who finds it won't need a loophole. They'll need the discipline to wait for the evidence, even when waiting costs them everything. Would you have known the difference, standing in that old Masset meeting hall in 2012, between a visionary who was early and a man who simply refused to wait? And when your own version of that moment arrives, will you?